So good afternoon, everybody. Really, really warm welcome to all of you, and thank you for joining us. I'm absolutely delighted this afternoon to be greeting Kate Mosse. I really look forward to having a conversation with her. She's, as you know, a very well-known and widely read author, novelist. I think she's probably most famous. I think she don't mind me saying this, for her book Labyrinth, which was an absolutely international bestseller. Apparently, it's been translated into 37 different languages, and it was on a bestseller list for a very, very long time. It's a brilliant book, and since then she's written lots of other extremely good books. But she's also written, and what I want to talk to you about today is this book. It brings us right up to date with the pandemic, and it's called An Extra Pair of Hands. And this is not a novel. This is really quite autobiographical. And it's also called A Story of Caring, Aging and Everyday Acts of Love. It's a really beautiful book. I loved reading it. I think it's an important book for those of us who may be caring or may need to care sometime in the future, perhaps for older parents or for our husbands or spouses, or perhaps for a disabled child, which is a kind of caring that I know quite a lot about. So Kate, let me come to you and welcome you and just ask you a very simple question. Why did you decide to write this book?
Well, hi Tricia, it's lovely to be here and waving at all of you along the screen. It's lovely to see so many on this hot afternoon. I wrote the book and it took me a long time to decide whether to write the book, because I'm a novelist and a playwright. I do write nonfiction, but I don't normally write personal stuff. I'm not an autobiographical writer. But I was approached by the Wellcome Trust, who I'm sure you will all know is the leading charity, I suppose, looking into issues of social care and medicine and things that are very relevant to contemporary society. And they have a series of books where they ask non-experts like me, but who have experience, to write about key topics of the day. And this one, of course, being social care and the need for care and who carers are. And I've been a carer on and off for 12 years. And I felt actually it was my responsibility in a weird sort of way to add my voice to all the voices talking about caring, why caring matters, who looks after the carers, how it can be that there are 13 million of us unpaid carers, but we are invisible, we're hidden everywhere in plain sight, and to actually try and shine a light on my own experience to help encourage a dialogue about so many of us who live our lives around caring for other people. And I think because I'm a novelist, I'm in a very privileged position, obviously, because I have not had to give up my job to be a carer. But many people, and I'm sure many who have joined the call this afternoon, will have been in that position where they did have to give up work to care for somebody. And I just felt, well, I'd like to talk about what it means to be a carer. I've been a carer on and off for 12 years. My mother and my father lived here. I supported my mother caring for my father, who had Parkinson's, and then kind of had a watching brief for my ma, who didn't need care, but did need company. They'd been married for nearly 60 years when my father died. And now I'm a full-time carer. So I've had 3 different caring experiences. And it's a book about love, really. I loved my parents and I loved my mother-in-law, Granny Rosie. It's a book, I hope, that is truthful, that it's such a privilege for me to care, but I'm in a position to be able to do it. But also, as everybody who's listening will know, it's tough. There are days where you just feel you're hopeless and you can never do well enough. And I felt to be honest about those things as well was quite important. And I suppose finally it's a tribute to my mum and my dad and to Granny Rosie, who at the age of 90, she's in a wheelchair. She needs a lot of support from me on a day-to-day business basis, but I've got a lot of people around me. And as we're doing this call, she's in the kitchen just over there. And before I came on the call, and don't judge anybody, I know it's only 4 o'clock, but I poured her a gin and tonic. I said, I'll be out in an hour. She said, all right then. So she's well set. She's well set up, waiting for me to come and join her later.
I think our admiration and love for Granny Rosie has just gone up several notches. Thought of her sitting in the kitchen sipping a gin and tonic.
Why not? She's 90. I mean, she wants to have gin and tonic.
Doing that.
Exactly.
That sounds absolutely fantastic. Okay, so I'd really like to, because your book is the story of how you needed to and how you cared for these three very important people in your life. So let's wind back the clock slightly to how you set up your personal circumstances, which meant that you were able to offer care to these three very important people in your life.
Yes, I think it's really important, this issue, because there's no one size fits all. Many people, I am 59, and a woman has a 50-50 chance of being a carer by the time she's my age. I've obviously been caring for longer than that, but that's the average. Men have the same odds not until they're 75, which suggests that men care for their partners, their wives, their spouses, and women care for everybody else as well. That's, you know, in a way what we would extrapolate from that. And that's what Carers UK says tends to happen. And as I said, I'm very aware of being in an extremely privileged position because two things. Firstly, I'm not doing it on my own. I have a husband, a partner who, well, he is a husband actually, but, you know, who is in it with me. We met at school when we were 15, which means he's known my parents. He knew my parents from a very early age, and I knew Granny Rosie. Both of my sisters live in neighbouring villages. My brother-in-law lives with us here now. He didn't then. My niece lives here at the moment. So I have a huge amount of backup. The big issue for many, many people is it's just them on their own. And that's one of the things that I feel really strongly about. How do we care for the carers? How do we give support for the people who are supporting other people? So it was easier for me than for many, many people. As I said, I didn't have to stop work because this is where I work. And if Granny Rosie needs me, and when my mum and dad needed me, I can hear. All they've got to do is call. So that makes an enormous amount of difference. Also, my children were at the stage, my Granny Rosie's lived with us for 25 years. So she was very much our extra pair of hands when the children were little. And my parents moved in 2009 when my son was 16 and my daughter was 18. So I wasn't trying to juggle childcare responsibilities at the same time. So those things all make a difference. And because we all come from the same area, we've all kind of either gone away and come back again, or some of the family have stayed put. That makes an enormous difference. We were able to offer a home to everybody because we had enough space. The place that we live in was ramshackle and derelict, and we bought it thinking there'd be room for everybody. And ironically, it had been an old people's home, and which was quite funny. But that was really helpful because it means that the bit that I'm talking to you in now, this used to be the warden's flat. There were already ramps in a lot of places. And we knew as my father's Parkinson's got worse as he declined, that he would be in a wheelchair and we would need all of these things. So these things they don't sound tiny, they're not tiny, but it meant that we already lived in an environment. I mean, we had to, do everything from scratch, and I will never get rid of the smell of cats from my life. I can still, when we first opened the door, it was like, oh, it had been left abandoned and neighborhood cats all moved in instead. But those things, such as anybody who knows this, who has a disabled child or a sibling or a partner or whoever they're caring for, to be in a house where the doors are wide enough for wheelchairs, for example. These things all make a difference when you're in a caring situation, because for a lot of people, it's very, very difficult. For other people, it was the natural thing to do because I adored my parents. They were brilliant parents. And it felt like repaying all the years of love that I'd had. Many of the people I've talked to have been caring and are caring for people they don't even know. It's quite common for husbands and wives to have remarried, and then somebody ends up caring for a stepfather or stepmother that they really don't even know because they're the only person there. So all of those things meant that it was much easier for us to set up the situation that we found ourselves in. All of the emotional things about loss and feeling hopeless when you can't stop somebody's pain, or the frustration that they feel when bodies wear out and you can't make it better, all of these things. Anybody who's a carer will know all of those things. And of course, they're, I think, the same for for anyone, but our practical situation meant that it was certainly a lot easier for us than it would have been for a lot of people.
Let's the first person that you needed to support was your dad, Richard Mosse, and you just said something very moving there about you know, how much you love your parents and your mother-in-law Rosie. And I think one of the things that I get very exercised about when we talk about the very old is that they are often seen as statistics and numbers, and they're dismissed. We've had an appalling thing reported that's been said today by the Prime Minister to do with not bothering to lock down second time around because it was only old people who were dying anyway, sort of thing. It was one of those dismissive comments, but it could have been made by any number of people, I think. So because your book is so beautifully written, as you would expect, just evoke for us a little bit about who your father was.
Well, I mean, that's a lovely question. And one of the things that I feel very strongly about is positive aging, and the fact that what matters is who a person is, what they do, how they say, what contribution they make in the world. I don't mean in terms of earning money or any of these things, but somebody of 90, like Granny Rosie, who spends all day, every day knitting for the Children's Hospice, she leaves an enormous footprint in the world because she's wonderful and beloved and fantastic. And then there are other people who don't do anything for anybody else at all and never have done, you know. So I absolutely agree with you that the narrative around aging needs to change. We should be saying it's amazing that the NHS has delivered generations of people who live into their 80s, 90s, and sometimes hundreds. But every time this comes up, it's presented as a problem. There's a problem that the NHS has worked, that people don't all die in their 50s. So I feel really strongly about this. And I've spent my life surrounded by older people. My godmother was 104 when she died. She was an Anglican nun. She was really, you know, bored by the end. She was, you know, really wanted to get on with the next stage of adventure. One granny lived to 98, the other granny lived into her 90s, my aunties lived into their late 90s. So I've grown up around older people, particularly older women, and you know, I would just hope that I can age like that. So my dad, he was, it's going to sound really old-fashioned, but it's the most accurate thing. He was a gentleman. He was an old-fashioned English gentleman. Even towards the very end of his life, when his Parkinson's was extremely disfiguring and disabling for him, he never failed to take his hat off when I would walk him around the block in the afternoons in his wheelchair. When people went past, he was, you know, touched his hat. And when he died, we had hundreds and hundreds of letters, and the word gentleman appeared in at least half of them. He believed that you spoke to everybody the same, that you were courteous, you treated people as you would want to be treated. He had a very strong Christian faith. And that was very much the bedrock to how he behaved in the world. He was a solicitor, but what he loved was being at home with his wife and children. And he was very much a family man. And he wasn't the sort of dad that ran about and played football and those sorts of things. He was very gentle and very quiet. But they both spent as much of their time doing underpaid things, working in the community, on committees. My mother was the chair of Scope. My father was part of Rotary and Probus, and you know, all of these things. They just believed that you did your best to make your community and the world a better place. And I admired them enormously. I didn't realize all the lessons I was learning at the time, but I learned how to care from watching them. You know, there were often people in our house who needed a shoulder to cry on. And the thing that I found very moving when my dad, and he was beloved, we were very close, my father and I, when he died, is that many people would write letters telling of an act of kindness he'd done, which we didn't know any of it. You know, they would say back in 1959, your father was the person who ... So he was the sort of great man that we should celebrate, as opposed to the great men who bluster and shout and end up on statues. You know, he was that sort of a man.
And your account of him is a great corrective to this idea that, you know, as I said, we can dismiss older people as relatively unimportant. You know, their death not mattering somehow because they reached an old age and they were going to die anyway. And I hate that attitude. I just think it's reductive, so many ways. So your dad, did you manage to keep your father more or less at home until he died and look after him at home?
We made a commitment, my mother and I, and Granny Rosie was part of this, that he wanted to die at home in his own bed, and we made a commitment to ourselves that we would do everything possible to make that happen. It's really important to say that it utterly depends the nature of the illness, or whether it's a long-term illness or something such as cancer. A lot of people don't have these choices. They are better in hospitals or hospices. And for many people, having parents at home would be the worst thing. They'd rather stay in their own home and have carers there, or actually be in a care home. Care homes often get a terrible rep, but there are many wonderful care homes, and many people are much less lonely in a care home. Everybody has to try to make the decisions for themselves, but mostly for the person you're looking after. The key thing with all of this is they are still them and you are still you. And what matters for me in the caring relationship was to never forget that I was always still my father's daughter and my mother's daughter and Granny Rosie's daughter-in-law, to not let it turn into a client-patient relationship, and also to learn to listen. That of course things can be done quicker if I do them. I'm really nippy. But what if actually my dad or my mum, or now Granny Rosie, it doesn't matter how long things take. They take as long as they take. You don't want to take away people's agency and take over. So my dad he very much wanted to die at home. His faith was extremely important to him, and very reassuring for us towards the end, particularly because he was just looking forward to the next stage. I'm doing research for my new non-fiction book at the moment, which follows some of my great-grandmother and grandmother's history. And he loved his mother and his granny. And in the last hours of his life, he was talking completely, before he became unconscious, about being reunited with the women that he loved. Not that he didn't love his father, but for him, he had TB when he was a boy of 6. And it meant that he had not been sent away to school. He had been kept at home with his mother and his granny and his sister. And I always felt that was part of why he was such a lovely man, because his formative time was spent with women, not being shouted at in a boarding school or some cold corridor sort of thing. And so he felt we were able to do that. We had a very good old-fashioned GP. With Parkinson's, any of you who know, I'm an ambassador for the Parkinson's Society, and my parents used to support it. It's a very disfiguring, very uncomfortable and painful condition to have. It's not curable, but you don't die of it in the same sort of way that if you have somebody who's dying of cancer who might need treatment or morphine or these sorts of things. So it really was, he felt a question of sitting it out, which he did. And he died very close to his birthday in May on a very lovely afternoon. We were all there together, my sisters and my mother and I, and Granny Rosie. And it was, I've always hated the euphemisms about dying, passing on and all of these things. But with that experience, I thought, no, this is a passing on. There's no doubt. It didn't feel like an ending. And it was a wonderful thing to be able to do that. It was not such a wonderful thing for one of our poor neighbours who arrived at the door with their child trying to get a sponsored swim form signed at the moment the undertaker appeared. And it was like rushing them out of the gate. And my father would have apologized. He would have said, I'm terribly sorry. He wouldn't have wanted to make anybody feel uncomfortable. So that was, we were very lucky to be able to do that. 2 out of 5 people say they would like to die at home, but very few people get that. And again, we were lucky to be able to do that because there wasn't a level of treatment that was needed that we couldn't provide.
That's a lovely story. I think that the concept of a good death, I'm very interested in that. We certainly achieved that with my own mother. I was only 42 at the time. She was only 67, but I could honestly say afterwards she had a good death, and we respected what she needed and wanted. Less so with my dad, but that's a completely different story. So how did your mum, Barbara, how did she cope after she lost your dad?
Well, we thought thought that my sisters, I have two younger sisters, we thought that she might just think, you know what, not sure it's worth it. They'd met when she was 19. They'd been married since she was 20. They were together nearly 60 years. And we just thought, she might just think for. But she didn't. She rallied. She was absolutely determined to find a new way to live as a widow, I suppose, as opposed to a wife. And this was something that I talk about quite a lot in the book, because for many women, they are suddenly alone without the person they've been with for a long time. And often, my mother wasn't like this. She was a teacher and a law lecturer. But many older women find themselves suddenly faced with a huge amount of paperwork, taking over all sorts of stuff that they've never done before. Whereas my mother had very much been part of everything, all those decisions. And because we were all living together, the last thing my father said to me before he slipped into a kind of sleep, before he died a few days later, was, look after your mother. And he felt that, he knew that we would, and she'd be here and my sisters were around the corner and all of these things. And for the next 3 years, she just really created a different sort of life. I do wish I'd asked her more about how much she missed him. I think we were very thrilled that she was out and about. She joined a choir. She started to volunteer at the local art gallery. She was entirely herself, my mother, until the day before she died. She had been a smoker all of her life, and she had COPD, so she often had issues with her with medication and warfarin for and all of these things. So she had things, but she was basically herself. And then she died terribly, terribly quickly. She felt a bit unwell. It looked like it was going to be another chest infection. Called an ambulance. It was Christmas 2014. The ambulance people came round to see how she was doing, and we were having conversations about living will. And it was very extraordinary with because we live in a small town, everybody knows everybody. Several of the ambulance people came to the funeral, and they were really shocked too, because she was there 1 minute, gone the next. But that is what she would have wanted. She was in her mid-80s. She had seen what decline looked like, and she did not want that for herself. And that's one of the things I write in the book as well, is that it's so important as a carer, if you can, and everything is different if you're caring for somebody with Alzheimer's dementia. It's a completely different situation. But if you're caring for someone who is still themselves in terms of those decision-making processes, and still knows you and you know them and all of these things, people want different things. And my mother absolutely wanted to go out on a high. And I don't know how she did it, really, if you know what I mean, but that was it. And I'd put all of her Christmas cards in the post, and I had to ring people up the next day and say, I'm really sorry to tell you that Barbara has died. And some people argued with me. They said, that can't be right. I've just had a card from her this morning. And I said, absolutely. She was writing her cards on Friday morning, felt ill on Saturday, and died yesterday. But it is exactly, it's a measure of her. So everybody remembers her as, she was on stage with the singing group that she and Granny Rosie were in, wearing a pair of fishnet tights. She had killer legs, very beautiful and lovely woman, singing Wine, Whiskey and Wild, Wild Women. And she was doing that on Thursday, 3 days before she died. So, it was a shock for us, but that's the way to do it. And I wanted to talk about those two different experiences, because it's very different grieving when you have been with somebody who's preparing to die, as my father was, as opposed to my mother, who essentially went, bye guys, I'm out of here. And it was a very different sort of experience. And I wanted to share those stories as well, because I think grief is different every time. Actually, I would say, whoever it is you lose, they bring their own loss with them, and it's not the same experience, even if you've lost people before.
I think both of those accounts are very interesting because they're contrasting, and yet they're both evidence of the possibility of a good death.
Yes.
Yeah.
And a good death is part of a good life, because the thing is, I've talked to a lot of doctors over the period of writing the book, and I've done a lot of events with doctors like Dr. Rachel Clark and Dr. Lucy Pollock, who's works in geriatric care and is a specialist in that area. And the thing is, it's going to come to us all. Nobody is exempt. So this idea of talking about a good death and what you want is part of living well, and about that sense of being yourself and having agency, having the power to make decisions if you are, or the person that you're caring for is in a position to do that. Because of course, many of the people I talked to when I was writing the book were caring for relatives, even sometimes relatively younger relatives with Alzheimer's dementias. And I do quite a lot of work with Dementia Trust in Sussex, where we live. And it's very different then if somebody isn't in a position to make those decisions for themselves. But I have been very lucky that both my parents were utterly themselves, as is Granny Rosie, gin notwithstanding. You know, and that is it's much easier to care for somebody if they are still themselves, obviously.
Yeah, absolutely. I was stimulated by something. We've got this special Facebook group called Super Troop. Somebody mentioned something called When I Die, which is a booklet that you can buy and you just make lots of notes in it. So I bought one and it's really helped me a lot. I hope it's a long time before I die. However, I like the idea of being able to write down everything that my two daughters will need to know when I do die. And that's, you know, from bank account numbers to the kind of funeral I'd like to have. I think we're quite squeamish about that. We're often quite squeamish about it, but I'm not at all. And I think
and it's good not to be squeamish, because I think it's a wonderful thing to know that you are fulfilling the wishes of the person that you cared for and you loved. Some people really don't want to talk about it, and I think that's their right. Granny Rosie and I do write about this in the book. Granny Rosie is very keen on, she's completely the opposite to my parents, in that she doesn't have a faith in any at all. And she thinks, you know, when you're gone, you're gone. You know, and she and I spent a very jolly evening last summer, where I'm afraid possibly a little bit too much wine was drunk, planning Rosie's funeral. And she was, you know, quoting lots of poems, and she still finds it absolutely brilliant that I can go on the internet and find any poem. And Rosie, you know, went to school in the 1930s, and she can remember every poem off by heart that she was ever taught. So we were looking them up, and she was choosing things and all these sorts of stuff. And then we got waylaid into, she wanted a wicker coffin. And then she discovered the cost of a wicker coffin, and she didn't want that. She thought that was terrible. So then we were looking into other things, cardboard coffins. And then we became completely helpless with laughter about how you carry a cardboard coffin and all. And so the thing is that, again, the point is that it's not up to me as Rosie's carer to say we are going to have these conversations. It's up to me to be receptive and to listen and support Rosie if she wants to have that conversation. And now Rosie has recorded the song that she wants played when she leaves, because she's a wonderful pianist. So she has recorded her own walkout song, which is going to have everybody weeping. But for her, she's really pleased about that, because she feels that she'll be there and part of something, you know.
Yeah, I mean, all of this, it's just so rare that we discuss this stuff.
And I've loved Liz Vardy has just put a message in the box about doing her own, and I think, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, it's important to talk about it. We really need to somehow get away from the squeamishness that there is around it. And how about you? Just a final question for you. When you're older, what are you hoping for?
Well, do you know, it's so interesting, because it didn't occur to me that people were going to ask me that, and of course that's what everybody asks me. And it's very interesting, because I realized that I kind of assume I'm going to be all right, which is ridiculous. You know, it's not my experience of different generations. But on the other hand, most of the people in my family have lived to a long age, and then they have died. And my father is the person who's needed the longest care. My godmother didn't need care until she was 102. She died at the age of 104. She was still in her order when she was 102. So I realized that I've been influenced by that I kind of think that my husband and I will look after each other. And that, oddly, given it has been a very defining part of who I am in my life, and I genuinely wouldn't have had anything any other way, I don't like the idea of my son or daughter having to give stuff up to look after me. So it's kind of it's very contradictory. You know, it's sort of, I know what I have gained from being a carer and what a privilege that's been, and how much I love to be able to do that. But when I think of my children having to do it for me, I think, well, I don't want them to have to stop doing whatever they're doing. So it's quite interesting. But I think one of the things that is very significant about being someone in my position. So I started being a carer in my mid 40s, really, is that you feel younger. I feel younger than a lot of my friends. I'm telling everybody I'm going to be 60 in October because I love a birthday, and 60 feels like nothing. And I do think that's partly because I spend a lot of time with older people, because 60 is nothing compared to most people who come in and out of this house. So, it feels quite remote, interestingly, the idea of my aging. Am I aware that my knees are a bit creaky? Yes. All of those things. There are lots of things. We all have the tiny declines. But because I spend every day with a 90-year-old who still has a real zest for life, on her bad days, not, it's horrible on her bad days, and she feels she won't wake up, and and I will be heartbroken when Rosie dies. But at the same time, most of our time, we have good time together. And so she's 90. And I think, well, no reason I'm not going to be 90. And of course, this isn't true, because that's not how genetics and illness works. It's not a matter of how you think about it. It's luck and what happens to you and your genes and stuff. But at the moment, I still feel quite in the first flush of youth.
Absolutely. And I think what's lovely about what you just said there about Rosie is that I think what we all would love to be able to do is to live right up until the moment when we no longer are alive. Yeah. And Rosie, even though she is perhaps physically, not as strong as she'd like to be, but she's still living.
Absolutely. And she does crosswords every day. She does the knitting every day. It's a very busy house. People come and go all of the time. It was harder during lockdown, particularly the last lockdown. And I'm very conscious of so many people who were completely isolated, people who live on their own, didn't see anybody. We had people here because the children came home. And Rosie loves that. She sits at the head of the table with all her stuff around her, and has a great deal of society, which a lot of older people don't have. And she often says, she did a lot of the publicity for the book with me. And the highlight of it all, it was lovely. We did a photo shoot for the Telegraph, for the Daily Mail, for Saga magazine. We were on the television doing Morning Live. And Rosie was, of course, a complete star. And in the book, I talk about the fact that she loves a show that some of you will know called Repair Shop, which is filmed very close to where we live here. And they had arranged for Will, who is the carpenter on Repair Shop, to come on. And so he came on and he said, I just want to say I'm a big fan of yours, Granny Rosie. I think you're marvellous. I've read the book and all of these things. And then when it finished, Rosie went, oh, isn't he dishy? And he is dishy. And, but that was the thing as well, doing the publicity for the book, because obviously I shared everything about the book with Rosie before it was published. I felt that anything she didn't want in the book would obviously not go in. She has and she kept saying, well, I don't know how you haven't put this in or that in. I said, well, I thought that was a bit personal. She said, oh, no, I don't mind. But she had a great joy of that, doing the photo shoots, camera people arriving. And it's that really, isn't it? We all know that it's about how you live that matters, and the energy, regardless of what you physically can do or not. Rosie hates being in a wheelchair. She's furious about it. She's the woman that, she spent all her life on horseback, and she cycled to work as a teacher. She cycled everywhere. She was she was a very, very physical woman, grew up at countryside, walked, 4 miles to school every day. So for her to lose the ability to walk has been really, really frustrating. But she does other stuff. Yeah. Instead.
Yeah, and it sounds like she's got and is still having an extremely good life. Thank you so much, Kate. That was absolutely brilliant, and love talking to you about that. And let me just pick your book up again. I thoroughly recommend it. It's a fantastic read, and it's very moving, and it's just a lot. The subtitle, A Story of Caring, Aging and Everyday Acts of Love, I think sums it up perfectly. So I can, as I said, thoroughly recommend it. It's a beautiful book for you. So now we're going to come to Emily and just see if you have any questions, please, for Kate.
Sure. We have one that I think you kind of covered, Kate, but I will just ask it Liz asked, I've arranged my own eco burial at a local pinewood, which is beautiful, and prepaid my funeral costs. Has Kate arranged her own passing?
No. But my husband and I have talked about those things, because we've talked a lot about, you know, the older generation. So we kind of have a sense of what we would both want in those situations, but we haven't gone quite as far. I still have both of my parents' ashes in my cupboard. So it's like, oh, where would they like to be? You know, all of these sorts of things. So they want to be together. We know this, but where is the question?
I just like to say something about that, because certainly when I was as young as you, Kate, I wouldn't have thought about it. But when I got into my 70s, I thought about it a lot more about, I started to think about my own funeral, believe it or not in a morbid way, not in a morbid way at all. And somebody recommended on our Super Troopers page a book that you can buy at Amazon. It's not very expensive, and it's called What to Do When I Die. So you can literally Google that, you know, put that into Amazon, it comes up, and it's like an exercise book, and it's just a memory jogger for all the things that people will need to know when you're no longer around. And as I said, for some of you, you'll just think, oh gosh, I couldn't possibly, you know, bear to think about that. I love it because it just, I've really enjoyed filling it in, aspects of it. And it's very practical. So it says things like, you know, these are my bank accounts, this is my passport number and stuff like that, anything that might be useful. But it also asks you what you would like to have, you know, maybe readings at your funeral, hymns, whatever. And you know, it's to get away from this subject that death is somehow taboo and that we can't actually talk about these things. And I don't see it as morbid. I see it as a little service that I can do for my two daughters.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, it's for the people who are going to be looking after things. It's not for you. Yeah.
Yeah. Right. Well, I'm not going to be there.
Yeah, quite.
So, Emily, any more questions?
Yeah, thank you, Kate. Catherine asked, just wondering, with Kate's very busy life, what do you do to relax?
Thank you, Catherine. Well, I mean, I'm a huge reader. I love the theatre. Obviously, I haven't been able to do that for quite a long time. The main thing that I do to relax, apart from obviously keep Granny company in the kitchen with her gin and tonic, is I walk. There's a lot in the book about the importance of landscape and the solace of landscape and being out in the, you know, the Sussex countryside, which is very much where my family comes from. And at the moment, I'm doing quite a lot of research. I've been in the Lake District because that's a very important part to my family as well. Obviously, all my fiction is set in, mostly historical fiction is set in France. So for me, it is walking and being out and about, and, you know, sometimes cycling and walking the dog and all of those things. But also, you know, just family and friends. You know, I can, part of the reason I can be a carer and enjoy it, not enjoy it, but do it with a relatively light heart as opposed to a heavy heart, is that I am very sociable. So I enjoy there being family and people around all the time. So, you know, if I have company and I've got the landscape outside the door, I'm okay.
Thank you. And then Liz also asked, is your book available on Audible?
It is available, Liz, on Audible, and I recorded it. It's the only time I've done that. I found it quite hard. There are some bits, obviously, as you would imagine, were quite hard to record, but we felt that it needed to be my voice. So yes, it is available on Audible. Yeah.
Brilliant, thank you. June says, I do a lot of caring for old and abandoned animals. Does that count? I'm not sure. Count for what?
Well, I mean, obviously, I think looking, it's anything that is that you are doing to make something better for, in your case, obviously for animals. I think for the you know, other people on this call, maybe for people, it's, you know, what I'm talking about very specifically is being responsible for another person, and being responsible for them every minute of every day. And so it's quite, that's quite specific. Whereas I think lots of people are carers. You don't have to live with the people that you're caring for. You don't have, you know, so many people have what I call a watching brief, and that counts as a carer. And the definition for the NHS is anybody, whether they live with the person or not, who takes some measure of responsibility for another person. And we saw, you know, wonderfully, despite the shocking behavior of our politicians at the moment, and you know, everything about all of this, which is really terrible, you see real people behaving really wonderfully. And so when at the beginning of the pandemic, they asked for volunteers, 1.5 million people signed up. So I think all of us normal people believe that you help look after other people. And in your case, obviously look after animals. But, you know, it's that back to the thing that I think my parents taught me, is that you try and make the world a better place. You know, you don't just do your own thing.
Brilliant, thank you. That's all of our questions for Kate. Tricia, I think Jane would just like you to clarify the name of the book that you recommended. Is it What to Do When I Die?
I think so. Certainly, if you put that into, I got it on Amazon. I'm sure it's available in other bookshops. But if you go onto Amazon and put that in the title, it will come up. It's an exercise. It's the size of an exercise book, and you know that's basically what it is. But it's a prompt to fill in all that information that will be very, very useful for anybody that needs to sort out your death and what happens after you die. And I just thought it was a little service that I could offer to my 2 daughters to get this ready and put it somewhere with my will and my enduring power of attorney and all those other things in one place as and when it would be needed. And so I hope that's helpful. I'll tell you what, I'll put it onto Super Troopers page. I'll take a picture of it and put it onto Super Troopers page, if that will help. Okay.
Thank you very much. That's all the questions for today.
All right. So all I need to do now, Kate, is just to say thank you. And
pleasure.
Once again, thoroughly recommend your book. It's really worth reading. And
it's not a gloomy book, is it, Tricia? You know, that's the thing. It's very joyous and funny in parts, because obviously it's impossible with Granny Rosie involved for it not to be. Somebody asked if she could come and say hello. I did peek, but she's asleep. So it's very, very hot.
I think books like this need to be written, and books like this need to be read. They're really helpful. They're supportive. They're there. You know, they're there because we do as a society need to talk about these things. And deal with them, I think, slightly better than we currently do.
Exactly.
And this book helps a lot with that. So Kate, thank you so much.
It's a pleasure, Tricia. It's been such a pleasure to meet you and to share this hour with so many of you. It's been lovely to see your faces at the top of the screen. I've been flicking through, so I think I've seen everybody now. So it's lovely. And any of you who are caring, you know, courage.
Power to your elbow. Absolutely.
Power to your elbow, exactly. Right.
Thank you, Kate. Bye-bye. And bye-bye.
Bye. Bye, everyone.